Hello, welcome back. And this is the second video on creative writing. And in this video, we'll be looking at different types of literature, what we call genre. And we'll look at the different tools that are used in order to do what we talked about last time, to defamiliarize language, to make us look twice, think twice about the language itself, but also about what the language is describing, what it's talking about. The moon, for example. And we'll draw some conclusions about creative writing in general and think about how we're going to approach the creative writing task. And before you can really start writing, you'll need to make some decisions about what type of story you want to produce, who will feature in it, where will it be set. And we also need to think about the reader, because after all, we're not just writing to express ourselves, we're also writing to reach others, to inform them, to entertain them, perhaps even educate them. So now that we've tried to define literature, let's have a look at some ways of classifying it or dividing it into major categories. It's generally divided into four main genres, and they are fiction, non-fiction, or factual literature, even though there isn't a clear distinction between the two necessarily, as we said last time, and then poetry and drama. Drama's written for the theatre or for the stage, and poetry is quite diverse. There are lots of subcategories of poetry. There's narrative poetry, poetry that tells a story, but there's also poetry that's written for the stage, dramatic monologues, for example. And finally, there's lyric poetry, which is often quite musical and quite emotional. It has kind of song-like qualities quite often. And that includes things like the ode or the sonnet, which has quite a specific form, 14 lines and a specific rhyme scheme, or the elegy, which is a poem of mourning written when somebody dies. We can divide up prose fiction in terms of its form and its length. So sagas are quite short. Short stories are longer, novellas are longer still, and once we get to a full-size book, we call it a novel. But literary genre can also be classified according to things like the style of writing, characteristics of the setting, the types of character that they feature. And these genres often have very specific features. For example, Gothic literature will mix realistic details with fantasy and will have quite a specific type of setting. Gothic stories are often set in old buildings or in graveyards, and there might be mist and it might be nighttime. There might be ghosts. It's very atmospheric. Science fiction, on the other hand, which is also known as speculative fiction, it deals with worlds that don't actually exist but are perhaps imaginable. So it might take a characteristic of the world as we know it, let's say robots or artificial intelligence or something like that, and then project that idea into the future. So let's imagine a world where technology like robots has taken over the world and they've become more powerful than humanity. So yeah, this would be a classic Gothic setting. And that's actually the front cover of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is one of the best known Gothic novels. When we're analysing literary language, there are various features or devices that we can look at. The most important for narrative or prose fiction are probably theme, so that's the ideas that the work deals with. Maybe it looks at something like migration, or maybe it looks at mourning, a grieving process or something like that. Then there's the narrator. Is it written in the first person? That means from an I perspective. Is it written in the third person, meaning about another that somebody describes the characters, he, she, and so on. What's the setting? That's where or when, where and when the story takes place. Characters, of course, the plot is what happens in the story. Then if we're analysing the language, there might be figurative language used, which is language that is not literally true. So if we look at this poem on the right, Fear, it is said, before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has travelled from the peaks of the mountains, etc. Now, here we can see there's some personification. We talk about the river as she, and the river can tremble. That's a type of figurative language. All together, the river stands as a symbol of something. She looks back at the path she has travelled. Perhaps this is about the path of somebody's life. So there's symbolism often in poetry, but there can also be symbolism in literary works. What does the vampire's bite to the neck symbolize? There's been a lot written on that, and a lot of people think it has to do with sexuality in some way. Metaphors are when two things are compared. There's something literal, but a kind of symbol is used to refer to it. So a rose is often used as a metaphor for love, let's say. Then a simile is when two things are compared. So if you say they were as tall as a giraffe, that's a type of simile. And foreshadowing and flashback relate to the plot. So foreshadowing is when we anticipate things that are going to happen. Flashback is when we jump back into the past and fill in elements of the background. And there's a glossary of these terms for you to look at after this video, and an exercise for you to test yourself a little bit to see if you understand them. And then cutting across genre, we have literary archetypes. Archetypes are building blocks of storytelling. And a German psychologist called Carl Jung came up with the term archetype. He noticed that certain characters showed up in all kinds of stories. So, for example, there might be archetypes representing universally representing bigger ideas. A baby can represent youth and innocence. A road may represent not just a trip, but also a journey through life. A river often represents change in some way. In the book on the right there, we've got a wasteland as the setting, and it's rather a pessimistic book about Nigeria trying to take control of its own destiny after independence. There have been more optimistic books written as well. And then there might also be certain stock characters that we get in all kinds of genre, all kinds of stories. The hero, the warrior, the traitor, the evil genius, the outcast, the wise woman or man, the oracle or the sage. And then there are certain types of plot that occur in many genre and in many types of work. Quests, for example, occur in medieval literature, but they may also occur in modern books. Journeys often occur in coming-of-age novels, that kind of thing. And now finally we come to creative writing. What is it, and why are we asking you to produce a piece of creative writing? Well, it's an important skill. It's important for expressing yourself, but it's also important for broadening your horizons and for exploring different ideas and themes and perspectives, even for exploring different worlds and imaginative realms. But as well as expressing yourself, you're writing for a reader. You're trying to capture your reader's attention and stretch their imagination and take them to an unfamiliar place. So this generally means that you need to tell your story in an imaginative and original way. You're writing to inspire your reader, but also to entertain them and perhaps inform them about your world, your reality, your internal life. But you don't need to stay rooted in the real world. You can blur the boundaries between imagination and reality. You can push your own imagination beyond the world surrounding you. And you'll perhaps want to incorporate literary devices, use symbols, give vivid details and descriptions. So by writing creatively, you stretch your use of language and make yourselves into more creative and versatile users of language. And I'd like to end by coming back to Anne Frank as an example of this, because she did so many of these things. Firstly, she wrote for herself, but she also wrote for an audience, but she didn't know whether she'd ever have one. And if you look at the quotes here, you can see she wasn't confident that anyone would want to read her writing and hear her voice. She writes, "Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me. Not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl." Well, how wrong she was about that. And it seems very strange and ironic now because it's one of the most famous and widely read works in the world. And that's all the more remarkable given that very little actually happens in Anne Frank's diary. She's locked in an attic all the time. And you can see as well that she always had ambitions for her writing. She wanted to be of use to the rest of the world. So she says, "I can always write for myself," but then she also says, "I don't want to have lived in vain like most people. I want to be useful, bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death." And of course, she succeeded in doing this by what she wrote. Perhaps the explanation for the enduring, the lasting popularity of Anne Frank's diary can be seen in the way she balances her own story against more general questions about humanity and human nature in general. So in this last quote, you can see she writes, "Human greatness does not lie in wealth or power, but in character and goodness. People are just people, and all people have faults and shortcomings, but all of us are born with a basic goodness." So her humanity, the way she thought about human nature, stands against the brutality of how she and her family and Jewish people in general were treated during the Second World War. And so I think what is interesting about her example is that she's famous. It's partly to do with the fact that her work is canonical, right? That it's so long lasting and still so popular. It has to do with who she was, of course, and where she was and when she lived and what she lived through and how she died. But it also has to do with how she expressed all this and wrote it down, which was different from how anyone else wrote about the huge historical tragedy of the Holocaust. So let's remind ourselves of what we've talked about in this video. We've looked at different ways of categorizing literature into types or genre. In terms of form, for example, poem, prose fiction, and so on, but also genre that features specific settings, types of plot, types of character. We've looked at literary devices as the language tools that creative writing uses to make meaning beyond just communicating a simple message, to broaden perspectives, give people different perspectives. And finally, we've looked at things like a voice and why we write. Are we writing for ourselves or for an audience, or are we doing both? And we looked at Anne Frank as an example of this. In the next video, I'll be talking you through the creative process, but do start thinking about what it is that you're going to write. And I think an important thing to remember is that your perspective is unique, and whatever story you choose to tell, whether it's from your life, whether it's real, whether it's entirely imagined, nobody will be able to tell it in the way you can, because you're an individual, and I'm sure you're going to produce something really great. Okay, goodbye.